Here's the challenge that I have today with you. You are spread across Canada. I don't know where your offices are, Ruben, but I'm assuming that they go from Toronto all the way to Vancouver and everything in between, right? If you look at this map of Indigenous peoples, and I recognize the word Aboriginal is on this map, it's a little bit dated, but for the sake of this conversation, you can see that from coast to coast to coast, there is a uniqueness of Indigenous communities from coast to coast to coast. So it's unfair and inappropriate for me to come to you and say, listen, I'm going to teach you a Mi'kmaq way of doing things. Because that may not be applicable to Vancouver because you're dealing with Haida Nation or the Tlingit Nation or Anishinaabe or Cree or whomever. So if I generalize about nation specifics in regards to culture, it may fall short for people who are not in that geographical area. This map shows you of the cultural diversity and difference between our Indigenous communities, our Indigenous peoples. Right? So you can just see it. It's a visual aid. I took this into consideration when I'm thinking of you. You are honoring me with your presence today. You are taking time out of your busy day to sit with me today. So I have a responsibility to service you the best way I can. The approach that I use today for this presentation and then question period after is I'm keeping the information and the approaches to gaining information for your offices very universal, for lack of a better word. You'll be able to take some of the information and the recommendations that I've provided you and run with them so that they are applicable to the First Nations, Métis communities, Inuit communities, or Inuvialuit people in your communities in your own way. So, why is this important then when we talk about land acknowledgements? I'll give an example. When I was doing work down here for our Southern Immigration Office, one of the things that was evident when I read it on their wall was that they copied and pasted it from somewhere else because they were making reference to a group, an Indigenous group that didn't have any presence in their geographical territory. So what does that tell me? That tells me as an educator that I have a responsibility to identify that land acknowledgements are incredibly important for Indigenous reconciliation. Why? This is the first time in Canadian history that Indigenous peoples have the ability and right to define themselves on their own terms. Think about that. The first time in Canadian history that Indigenous peoples have the right and ability to define themselves. For me, land, water, air is a key component of who I am. Therefore, if you wish to acknowledge me, Mi'kmaq people, Cree people, Anishinaabe people, Inuit people, Dene people, Dakota people, you must recognize that a part of their identity is attached to the land on which they stand. So, instead of just having a generic printed out land acknowledgement that you put on the wall and say, look, we're doing reconciliation, why not take the time and speak from your heart and write it so that it shows that some time was taken to reflect upon the people who are in your territory? This is what I wrote. This was specifically designed for my work with new Canadians in southern Manitoba. You can use this if you wish, but I would encourage you to use it as a guide and have you and your team sit and reflect about meaningful language that could be placed on your land acknowledgement. Here we sit, and I write oftentimes like I speak. Here we sit, one facing the other, on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, and Dakota people. This land where we have come together to talk and to share, to learn from one another, is also recognized as the original homeland of the Métis Nation. I acknowledge and respect the treaties that were produced, reviewed, discussed, and signed by the ancestors and representatives of Canada in this territory. I acknowledge that these treaties are still active and relevant to the Indigenous peoples mentioned above, the peoples who still reside in this territory and call it home, as well as to all peoples who are currently visiting and or live in this beautiful part of Canada. We at Red Road Compass dedicate ourselves to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation, collaboration, education, and healing. I am honored and thankful for being here. So you will note in here that I did not make reference to the specific treaty number. Our area here is Treaty Number 4, signed in 1874 at Capel Valley, just here in Saskatchewan. I'm cautious about using treaty numbers as the point of reference of this collaboration between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. This treaty in our area was signed in 1874, as I've said. History existed for millennia before that. So in order for me to avoid perpetuating a colonial attitude of using a treaty as the point of measurement of worth or identity, what I do is I just recognize in the second paragraph that treaties exist, but at the very beginning, I start with the acknowledgement that Indigenous peoples were here. Because oftentimes you'll say, we acknowledge through treaty number 4 that. Fair enough, but if you're really precise in your language and interpretation, that reveals to your audience that you're using a colonial document as a document for acknowledgement of existence.